And my viewer was Hella Hammond, who was an old friend of ours, distinguished photographer for Life magazine, spoke many languages, just a highly intelligent, capable woman. And we invited her. The CIA was looking for a control person. Said, you work now with Ingo Swann, who is a lifetime psychic. You work with Pat Price, who is a retired police commissioner, been psychic all of his life. Can't you find somebody who never did this before? Can't you find an ordinary person? Now, nobody would ever consider Hella an ordinary person, but she had not done this before. So I said, well, Hella, today we're going to try and describe Brezhnev's office in the Kremlin. And neither of us had been to Russia ever. And she said, well, I'm walking down a hall, and I see it all covered with brocade red material. At the end of the hall, the door covered with red leather, and the leather is held in place by brass upholstery tacks. Now, I never know what the answer is, but I know what the answer has to look like, and for the CIA to be satisfied, we're going to need more than the door to the place. So I said, okay, I'll push open the door, and let's see what's inside. And she said, well, it's dark inside, which would have been appropriate because they're 8 hours ahead of us. So I said, okay, Hella, I'll turn on the lights, and you can just look around and tell me what you see. So she said, well, on the left, I see windows looking out to Red Square, and on the right, I see a great big wooden desk covered with glass, and behind the desk, there's a door in the wooden wall. And I said, well, why don't we open that? And she said, okay, we can go down the stairs. And as we walk down the stairs, says Hella, there's a big row of computers. There's computers on the left and computers on the right. We're in some kind of very large computer room just down the stairs from this big office. And I had a lot of security clearances, but I was not cleared to be in a Kremlin computer room. That was outside of my clearances, and I began to feel frightened. So sort of paranoia flash of I've extended too much of myself into the Kremlin basement. So I said, I think we've given them enough info, Hella. Let's get out of here. And what happened is that 2 years later, I was done with I had quit the SRI program. I was doing other things. And I was invited to Russia to talk to the Soviet Academy of Sciences. And I gave a lecture in the Kremlin, which they were very happy about. I told them there are no secrets anymore, and that was very shocking for people in the Kremlin to hear, because Russia was paranoid over secrecy and fear. And they said, well, is there anything you'd like to see as long as you're here? And I said, as a matter of fact, I'd like to see where Prime Minister Brezhnev has his office. I don't need to meet the Prime Minister, of course, but I'd like to see what his office looks like. So they walked me down this hall just off the side of the big lecture room, and I saw the door with the red leather and the brass upholstery tacks, and we walked into the room, and I could see Red Square off to the left and the desk on the right. I did not ask him what's behind the desk, but what I saw greatly corresponded to what Hella drew 2 years ago. So this is a case where I had to wait 2 years for my feedback, but it was as though that was the reward for this kind of shared out-of-body experience that Hella and I had walking down the corridors of the Kremlin it was like a shared lucid dream.
Yes. And I'd like to find out if you had other remote viewing time travel experiences of any sort, where you mentioned seeing things a few days in advance. What's the longest time interval that you'd personally looked at, whether or not you got the validation, but how far forward or back are you able to talk about?
Well, the most interesting precognition experiment is something that we did after I left SRI. The SRI program became more and more classified. While I was at SRI, Hal and I were able to publish scientific papers in Nature magazine and in the Proceedings of the Engineering Society, and we wrote a book called Mind Reach. But by 1982, the whole program was so secret we couldn't publish anything at all. And my feeling is that I didn't go to graduate school to become a psychic spy for the CIA. So I left the program. I was not happy just doing operational things for the CIA and other government agencies. We work for all of the agencies of the intelligence community. We did all sorts of things. The one we did looking furthest into the future was after I left SRI. I formed an organization which we called Delphi Associates. One of the things we did is make ESP toys for Atari, ESP video games, and we spent some time forecasting silver commodity futures, so that on a Monday we would try and forecast whether silver would go up a little, up a lot, down a little, or down a lot the following Friday. So we were looking 5 days in the future. Now, it's very hard to read things psychically. The great psychic Pat Price could read documents in the safe. Price was able to read top secret code word documents in the safe at the National Security Agency, and that had a whole investigation of itself. Why would anyone target us to penetrate the NSA? So that was another story. But that was real time. Price was able to read code words and code names of things in the NSA 3,000 miles away. The story that I'm telling you now is we were trying to forecast the commodity market, and what our broker did is that he knew that we couldn't say silver is going up a quarter or down a quarter, so he would choose 4 objects that would stand for the possible changes. So he would have maybe 4 objects on his desk. He'd have a cup of coffee, which meant up a lot. He'd have a book, which meant up a little. He'd have a flower that meant down a little. And on one case, he had his leftover breakfast, which meant down a lot. So I'm sitting at home, 50 miles away in Palo Alto. The broker is in Marin. And I say, okay, here we are Monday. On Friday, I am going to hand you an object. Got it? It's a very simple object. It has nothing to do with the stock market. I'm going to hand you an object on Friday. Can you describe what I'm going to hand you? What's the surprising object I'm going to put in your hand? And the psychic might say, I see something round, and it's kind of floppy, and it's got a funny smell. So as an experienced interviewer, he just said 3 sentences, but I know that that's very good sounding remote viewing. That is, he's not guessing, he's really telling me about his experience. So I say, that's terrific. I'll see you Friday. And I called the broker in Marin and said, well, I've got a very interesting description. What are your objects? He said, well, I've got a coffee cup, a book, some flowers, and my leftover pancake for breakfast. And I say, well, I think my psychic dial described your pancake excellently. You got it round and floppy and a funny smell. And John said, well, that certainly describes a pancake. Now, the trust comes in that because the psychic described the floppy pancake, we're going to sell $50,000 worth of silver into a rising market. because we're going against the Hunt brothers here who were buying silver, and on this day we were selling silver, and that was one of our most successful hits. As we sold silver, the market had a little crash that day, and we made a lot of money. And we did this 9 times in a row. We call this associative remote viewing. You see, we're not looking at the big board at the commodity exchange. We're just focusing on what am I going to hand you next week. And in 9 trials like that, we were successful 9 times out of 9 and made $120,000. So when you ask, this is sort of a long answer to your question, can you look into the future? And rather than tell you a story about funny things that happened in the lab when we looked into the future, this is an experiment published in the Wall Street Journal where we made $120,000 forecasting silver futures. And this is a nice experiment because nobody could whisper the answer to us. It's something you can only get psychically, and we did it correctly.
That's absolutely wonderful, and I'm so glad it was documented, and it's such a great success story. Thank you. I'd love to talk about, you mentioned earlier that non-locality, it's a quantum concept, and it could be one way to understand what's behind a scientific explanation for remote viewing. Would there be other attributes of quantum physics that might help us better understand what's going on? And maybe you could explain for just the layperson, how does this non-locality factor into everybody's lives?
Well, in the 1920s, Schrödinger perfected quantum mechanics so it could be used. He gave a closed-form equation for solving problems quantum mechanically, and he said the most important thing in all of quantum mechanics is the entanglement, that is, particles born together stay together. For example, if you create 2 photons in a single experiment, and those photons go off to the left and off to the right, and you grab the one on the left, the one on the right knows that his twin has been grabbed. It's like things with identical twins. There are many, many stories of identical twins, and there's even a successful movie right now about identical triplets, where something happens to one of the other triplets. The 2 brothers all dress alike, they all sound alike, as though they're entangled, even though they had never met until they're adults. There's a famous case of 2 brothers who were put up for adoption, both named Jim, and they both became firemen, and they each married a girl named Linda. After a while, they divorced Linda, and then each married a different girl named Betsy, and so forth. And they didn't get together until they were brought to Minneapolis, where the Twin Studies program was, and they learned that they had all done these things in common, as though they were entangled. That they had so many things entangled that there have been many, many articles. If you look up the Jim twins on the internet, you'll find many articles because there's no end of interest in these 2 guys who lived far apart from one another, were adopted as little babies, and as though they were just mirror images of one another. And this is the way the photons are. So the idea of the photons being entangled is no more surprising than adult people being entangled. In fact, it's less surprising. We've known about identical twins being entangled for decades, centuries. So experiments were done in 1970 by Friedman and Clauser at Berkeley, showing that these photons born together remain entangled. It's as though you have 2 tuning forks in your laboratory, both tuned to A440. If you strike one of those tuning forks, then the brother tuning fork across the room will ring. And it's because they're both resonant to the same frequency, and striking the tuning fork on the left causes the tuning fork on the right to ring. This would be a very simple example of entanglement, except the photon